There are moments in life that don't just change your path. They dismantle the world you thought you understood. They take the solid ground beneath your feet and replace it with shifting sand. For 45 years, my stability had a name, Elijah. He was the anchor, the quiet strength that allowed me, Lena, to navigate the often chaotic waters of family life and the relentless demands of parenthood. We had built a fortress of shared memories, financial prudence, and, most importantly, unspoken trust. Our mornings were a predictable symphony of comfort. The scent of his particular dark roast coffee, the rustle of the financial page he always read first, and the gentle light that filtered through the bay window of the dining room. It was on one of those mornings, a Tuesday, the kind of day that begins with the promise of tedious domestic errands, that the music stopped. I remember every detail of that morning, with a crystalline clarity that time has refused to dull. It was late autumn. Outside, the world was retreating into a chilled gray, but inside? Our kitchen was warm with the familiar heat of the toaster oven and the soft murmur of the local news. Elijah was agitated, not in an angry way, but with a low, simmering tension that made the muscles in his jaw twitch slightly. He wasn't looking at the newspaper. He was staring at the space just above the rim of his cup, his eyes distant. For a man whose life was measured in meticulous audits and balanced ledgers, this distraction was highly unusual. "Is the coffee too strong?" I asked, my voice light, attempting to break the spell. He didn't answer right away. He simply set the cup down with an almost deliberate precision, the clink of ceramic against saucer echoing unnaturally loud in the silence. When he finally looked at me, the wisdom I had relied upon for decades seemed momentarily clouded by something akin to deep, weary fear. "Lena," he said, his voice a low gravel, "we need to talk about things." I frowned, pushing aside a stack of glossy mail, mostly junk that had accumulated on the counter. "Talk about what, dear? We've got the dentist appointment on Thursday, and I still need to call the plumber about the water pressure in the guest bathroom." I was trying to normalize the moment, to pull him back to the reassuring banality of our shared routine. He shook his head, dismissing my practicalities with a wave of his hand. "Not those things. The real things. The things we've avoided. The things that matter when I'm not here to manage them." That phrase, "when I'm not here," was like a sudden, unexpected drop of ice water on my skin. We were both in our late 60s, and we spoke of wills and trusts with the detached formality of responsible adults. But Elijah rarely entertained the morbid finality of his own absence. His sudden insistence gave me a cold chill, yet I still resisted the urge to panic, convinced he was merely stressed about a client file or a market downturn. "Elijah, you are perfectly fine," I countered, forcing a calm smile. "You had your checkup 2 months ago. You have the heart of a marathon runner, according to Dr. Shaw. Don't start talking like that. You're just worrying yourself over nothing." He reached across the table, taking my hand in his, a gesture, not of affection, but of solemn urgency. His grip was surprisingly tight. "No, Lena, listen to me. There are forces at play, things you cannot see, that are trying to compromise what we have built. And if anything happens to me, you must remember this one thing, this single command." I held my breath. The routine of the morning completely dissolved. "Do not let them in." The words hung in the air, weighted with an intensity that defied explanation. They were cryptic, theatrical even, yet delivered with a sincerity that brooked no argument. Them? Who was them? Was he talking about the bank? His company? I waited for him to elaborate, to provide the context that would transform the vague dread into recognizable danger, but he simply stared at me, his eyes pleading for understanding. "Elijah, you're scaring me." "Who is them?" He opened his mouth to reply, and the answer was on the very edge of his tongue. I saw the struggle, the internal debate. The moment he almost confided the dark secret that had been pressing down on him for weeks. And then he recoiled, not physically, but mentally. It was as if a heavy curtain had been drawn across his mind, sealing off the revelation. "I can't," he finally whispered, his voice suddenly weak. infused with a self-censure I didn't understand. Not yet. I need more time to confirm the extent of it. But please, promise me. If you ever find yourself alone, fighting for what is ours, you must remember that command. Do not let them in. Do not sign anything. Do not agree to anything. I was about to press him further to demand clarification, to dismiss the conversation as the result of a sleepless night, when the light behind his eyes flickered. It was a momentary shadow that passed over his expression, followed by a look of bewildered confusion. He blinked, the intensity draining away, replaced by a strange, vacant calm. "Did you remember to defrost the chicken for dinner?" he asked, his tone suddenly light, casual, as if the previous 3 minutes of intense, fearful warning had never occurred. I stared at him, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The shift was terrifying in its speed and totality. Was this the medical stress I had tried to rationalize? Had I imagined the fear in his eyes? Or was this the subtle, insidious manifestation of the very fear that he had been hiding? I was left grasping at the tail end of a crucial conversation that had been deliberately cut short, leaving me with a profound sense of foreboding. "Yes, Elijah. I remembered the chicken," I replied, the lie catching in my throat. I hadn't remembered the chicken. My mind was still reeling from the phrase, "Do not let them in." We moved past the moment, or rather, he moved past it. He returned to his paper, discussing interest rates with his usual sharp wit. But I felt a permanent shift in the atmosphere of our home. The silence between us was now burdened with the weight of the unspoken. I kept my guard up, observing him, searching for further signs of distress or confusion, but he seemed entirely normal. Perhaps he had simply been worried about the market, I tried to convince myself. Perhaps he was having an off morning. I spent the next hour working in the sunroom, tempting to distract myself by planning the rose garden for spring. The sunroom was my sanctuary, a place where I felt closest to nature and farthest from the complex, often dark realities of the world. But even here, I couldn't shake the persistent echo of his voice. "Do not let them in." I went over our list of them. The aggressive real estate agent who kept sending offers, the telemarketers, the distant, estranged cousin who occasionally tried to borrow money. None of them warranted such a severe, solemn warning. None of them seemed capable of compromising what we have built. I walked back into the kitchen, drawn by the need to see him again, to reassure myself that the morning's exchange was nothing more than a momentary lapse. I found him standing by the counter holding the cordless phone, his back to me. He was speaking in low, urgent tones, his voice muffled. "Yes, it has to be immediate. I need the revised documents sent to my private email." "No, they cannot know. Especially not now. This is a private matter. Strictly confidential." My blood ran cold. The secrecy, the urgency, the fear of them knowing it all crystallized into a moment of pure, blinding realization. This wasn't about a bad morning or market jitters. This was about a crisis unfolding in secret, a crisis so profound that it required clandestine communication. I waited for him to hang up, rehearsing the confrontation in my mind. I would demand to know who he was talking to. I would demand to know what confidential document was being revised. I would insist that after 45 years, he was obligated to share the full weight of this fear with his partner. He placed the phone back on the hook, still facing away from me. He took a single, slow step toward the living room, and that's when I saw it. It wasn't a slow stumble or a gradual fall. It was an instantaneous, absolute collapse. His body went rigid, then crumpled, falling silently onto the thick Persian rug that had covered our living room floor since our first anniversary. There was no cry, no sound of impact, just the terrible, sudden silence of a structure that had been instantaneously dismantled. My own scream seemed to come from a long distance away. I ran to him, dropping to my knees beside his motionless body. His eyes were open, staring upward, but there was nothing recognizable in them, no fear. No recognition, only a terrifying, empty void. His face was slack, his right hand lying palmed on the rug, unmoving. He was breathing, but the breaths were shallow, rattling, and inadequate. The matriarch's world had not just shifted, it had shattered. The anchor was gone, replaced by a devastating, immediate emergency. I scrambled for the phone, my hands slick with adrenaline, dialing the 3 numbers that sever one life from another, 911. I remember speaking in clipped, authoritative sentences, forcing myself to be calm, to be clear, to be the commanding officer in this sudden, terrible war. My husband has collapsed. I believe it is a stroke. Immediate assistance required. Address is 1420 Sterling Avenue. The next 20 minutes were a blur of sirens, flashing red and blue, and the terrifying, intrusive presence of strangers in our sanctuary. Paramedics moved with ruthless efficiency, transforming Elijah's body from my husband into a patient a series of vital signs and readings. I stood back, pressed against the doorway, watching the last vestiges of our shared life being wheeled out on a stretcher wrapped in aluminum foil blankets, covered by the clinical detachment of emergency medicine. The diagnosis was swift and brutal, a massive hemorrhagic stroke. He was alive, the doctor explained in a hurried, impersonal voice, but the damage was extensive. He was in a state of deep, nonverbal incapacitation, and the prognosis was, at best, uncertain. I sat in this sterile waiting room of the emergency department, clutching a cheap paper cup of lukewarm water, the phrase, "Do not let them in," echoing in the cavernous silence of my mind. The vague dread of that morning had crystallized into the cold, sharp reality of the crisis. He was gone, not dead. But trapped a living ghost, and the conversation was unfinished. It was in this moment of profound isolation and fear that they arrived. Not the anonymous forces Elijah had hinted at, but the familiar figures who, until this morning, I would have sworn were the only people I could truly rely on. Marcus, our son, and Kira, our daughter-in-law. They rushed in, Marcus looking pale but controlled, Kira looking perfectly grief-stricken, her eyes red-rimmed, but her clothing impeccably neat. They enveloped me in an embrace that felt, even in my shock, oddly suffocating. "Mama, we came as fast as we could," Marcus said, his voice deep and seemingly concerned. Kira called the office and they told her about the ambulance. "We'll take care of everything. You just need to focus on staying calm." He was already adopting the air of command, subtly taking charge. The moment he did, the weight of Elijah's final, desperate warning came crashing down on me, heavy and suffocating. "Do not let them in." I recoiled slightly, pulling away from their embrace. "I'm fine, Marcus. The doctors are still running tests. They'll update me." But he didn't listen. He was already talking to the receptionist, his voice confident and authoritative, asking specific questions about Elijah's status, discussing the transfer to the neurology ICU. He was making decisions, moving things forward, and in my state of shock, I let him. I watched the ease with which he took the lead, the way Kira stood beside him, her hand resting solicitously on his arm, nodding with an exaggerated compassion that grated on my raw nerves. It was Kira who approached me next, her face a mask of sympathy. "Lena, honey, Marcus and I have been talking. You cannot be alone right now. The house is too big, and you know how emotional you get when you're tired. We've already arranged for you to come stay with us, just until Elijah is stable." The words were soft, coated in concern, yet they carried the unmistakable scent of dispossession. "The house is too big. We've arranged for you." I looked at my son, then at my daughter-in-law, and the world tilted. They weren't offering comfort. They were asserting control. I saw the calculated pity in Kira's eyes, the cool, detached efficiency in Marcus's movements, and I knew, with a certainty that sliced through my grief, that they were the them Elijah had been desperately trying to warn me about. The unspoken war had begun, not with a sudden shot, but with the soft, insidious sound of a key turning in a lock they assumed I was too devastated to notice. I was alone, without my anchor, and the people I was supposed to trust were already closing in. The house, the finances, the last conversation, it was all compromised. And my fight for my life, my love, and my legacy had just started. I had to remember every word of that desperate final warning. I had to find a way to honor the plea of the man who now lay silently incapacitated, his life hanging by a thread, his secret left, tragically, untold. The crisis was not just Elijah's collapse. It was the sudden, terrifying realization that the people I had been trusting for years were not allies, but predators. The hospital waiting room became the staging ground for the silent takeover. In the hours that followed the stroke, the sterile air thickened with Marcus's increasing authority and Kira's performative sympathy. I remained physically present but emotionally detached. A shell of the woman I was hours before, yet acutely aware of the drama unfolding around me. This detachment was, perhaps, my only defense. Grief is a heavy cloak, but the cold realization of betrayal is a shield. It freezes the tears and sharpens the focus. Mama, you need rest. The doctors said it could be days before he stabilizes. Marcus insisted, standing over me, phone pressed to his ear. I noted the possessive, controlling tone he had adopted. It wasn't the voice of a worried son. It was the voice of a man clearing obstacles. I'm coordinating with the finance team at Dad's office. They need a contact point. And since you're so overwhelmed, I've given them my information. It's just easier, right? He didn't wait for my agreement. He spoke it as a statement of fact. A decision already executed. Kira, meanwhile, was strategically circulating. A tragic, hushed figure. I watched her approach a nurse, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that still managed to carry. Lena is so fragile. She forgets things easily. We are worried about her memory. It's just so much for her to handle alone. Fragile. The same word the competitor's daughter-in-law used, but this time the context was far more immediate and chilling. She wasn't just observing my grief. She was establishing a narrative. She was laying the groundwork for the same incompetence diagnosis Elijah had feared. She was weaponizing my shock. I remembered the recent instances now with a clarity that stung. The missing car keys I'd found in the junk drawer, the appointment Kira had reminded me of being an hour later than I thought. Each minor oversight, each moment of normal elderly confusion had been seized upon, magnified, and then subtly fed back to me as proof of my supposed decline. It was the insidious nature of gaslighting, making the victim doubt their own reality until they are grateful for the help of their manipulator. I had been so convinced of my own frailty that I had thanked Kira for her assistance. This profound manipulation had been ongoing, slowly eroding my confidence for months. But now, without Elijah's grounding presence, the pace was accelerating. They were not waiting for me to break down. They were actively pushing me into a designated role, the confused, fragile matriarch who needed to be managed. The sight of Marcus confidently signing a form at the nurse's station sent a fresh jolt of alarm through me. I pushed myself up from the cold plastic chair and walked over, my movements deliberate and slow. I had to regain control of the moment to test the boundaries of their newly claimed power. "Marcus, what are you signing?" I asked, my voice steady, betraying none of the internal turmoil. He turned, startled, his practiced composure momentarily cracking. "Mama, I told you, you need to rest. It's just the transfer consent for the ICU. They need my signature as the immediate family point of contact, since you're in shock." "I am his wife," I stated, placing my hand flat on the form, covering the signature line. "I am his legal next of kin. I will sign the transfer documents. Hand me the pen." Kira stepped in quickly, her hands settling on my back in a gesture meant to soothe but feeling like a push. "Lena, honey, let Marcus handle the paperwork. He's organized. You're exhausted. You don't need the stress of liability forms." "I am exhausted, but I am not illiterate," I replied, maintaining eye contact with Marcus. The challenge was direct, impossible to ignore. For a split second, I saw a flicker of pure, unadulterated annoyance in his eyes, the genuine irritation of a plan being momentarily derailed by an unexpected obstacle. "Fine," he snapped. Handing me the clipboard with a controlled resentment, I signed the form. Not as Lena, the distraught wife, but as Lena Odom, the partner of 45 years, the woman who would not be dismissed. The act of signing felt like a small, desperate victory in a war that was still entirely secret. It affirmed my autonomy, even as my heart broke for the man lying helpless in the room beyond the double doors. The small confrontation served a crucial purpose. It forced them to retreat, to acknowledge my presence, and to show me the sharp edge of their true intent. They were not here to grieve. They were here to execute. And in that moment of fragile, hard-won clarity, I remembered the final, crucial detail of Elijah's frantic morning call, the detail that tied his fear directly to their presence. He had been on the phone, speaking of a revised document that must be kept secret. No, they cannot know. The context now screamed at me. Elijah hadn't been preparing for death. He had been anticipating a sudden, debilitating incapacitation that would strip him of control. And he had been revising a legal countermeasure to protect me. His stroke had occurred before he could finalize the plan, before he could tell me what they were after. His final panicked actions were a scramble to safeguard me against this precise moment. I slipped my hand into the pocket of my coat, seeking the familiar weight of my car keys, a reflex of safety. Instead, my fingers brushed against the small, unfamiliar texture of a folded piece of paper. I pulled it out, concealing it in my palm. It was a note scribbled quickly on a torn-off corner of his financial paper, left there deliberately. The handwriting was Elijah's, shaky but legible. Check the safety deposit box. File 14, redacted POA. A chill ran through me, far colder than the air conditioning of the hospital. Redacted POA. POA stood for Power of Attorney, the one document that gave one spouse absolute control over the other's life and assets during incapacitation. Elijah had been trying to redact or nullify a POA-1 that Marcus and Kira were likely preparing to activate, or perhaps one they had already fraudulently obtained. This was the document they were trying to rush through, the one that would finalize my erasure. This was no longer just a familial disagreement about an elderly parent's housing. This was a sophisticated, premeditated financial and legal coup. The full weight of the matriarch's resolve settled upon me. I was not fragile. I was not confused. I was a woman who had just been handed the first piece of evidence in a crime against her life, her husband, and her legacy. And I was going to fight. I carefully folded the note and tucked it into my bra, the most private place I could think of. I looked up at Marcus, who was now speaking quietly with Kira across the room, both of them under the misguided impression that they were in control. I met Kira's calculating eyes and offered her the sweetest, most vacant smile I could muster. "You're right, honey," I whispered, loud enough only for her to hear. "I am so tired. Thank you for worrying about me." The lie was convincing. Her expression shifted from cautious vigilance to relieved condescension. She had won the moment. She believed I was retreating into my mandated role as the shocked, fragile widow -2-B. But the matriarch had not retreated. She had just found her weapon. The final words of Elijah. The living ghost echoed one last time in the sterile silence. But now they were not a command of fear, but a battle cry. Do not let them in. I would not let them in. I would find that safety deposit box, and I would expose the weapon they were planning to use against me. The terrifying truth about betrayal is not the moment you realize it, but the chilling requirement to instantly become a masterful actor. You must smile while your world collapses, and nod while the predators plan your demise, all to gain the crucial time needed to strike back. When I had looked into Kira's eyes and offered that saccharine, a manufactured smile, the one that signaled my feigned retreat into fragility, knew I had begun the most dangerous performance of my life. I was not the victim they assumed. I was the matriarch who had just been handed a secret key. Elijah's note, the mention of the redacted POA. Nestled now beneath my clothes was a physical connection to the man I loved, a command from a mind still sharp, trapped behind a silent prison of stroke damage. It was his final frantic move on the chessboard, and now it was my turn. But before I could execute his strategy, I had to survive their immediate, aggressive power grab, the transition from concerned family members to designated. Controlling guardians was shockingly swift. The hospital became their domain, and my presence was immediately categorized as an inconvenience. Mama, you can't stay here, Marcus declared late that evening. Having spent hours coordinating with nurses, making phone calls, and presumably laying the groundwork for his next move. You are just getting in the way, and you need to sleep. Kira has everything ready at our place. His voice was firm, yet laced with that condescending edge that he had perfected since marrying. Kira, 5 years ago, a tone that suggested my age had stripped me of my own agency and reason. I watched him now, and for the first time I saw not my son, but the orchestrator of a calculated scheme. The unconditional love I had offered him for 35 years curdled into cold, protective suspicion. I will not leave Elijah, I stated, the authority in my voice surprising even myself. I will sleep in the waiting room. Kira materialized instantly, her expression radiating exhausted empathy. Lena, honey, please think about Elijah. If you collapse from exhaustion, who will advocate for him? We are here for him, but we also have to manage the house. This is a 5-hour round trip for us. It's just smarter if you come stay with us. Notice the subtle shift in language. They were advocating for Elijah while I was merely a drain on resources. They were framing my decision to stay by my husband's side, the most natural impulse for a spouse, as a selfish process. Irrational burden on their superior, smarter organizational efforts. The gaslighting wasn't just about my memory. It was about positioning me as an impediment to Elijah's proper care. I shook my head slowly, playing the part of the stubborn, weary old woman. No, I will not be far from him. Just bring me a change of clothes tomorrow, Kira, and bring my reading glasses. This small act of resistance, my refusal to leave the hospital, triggered the next phase of their attack. They realized that controlling my physical location was impossible without direct coercion. So they moved to control my access. The following morning, after a long, uncomfortable night spent dozing intermittently in a chair that offered no comfort, I approached the neurology ICU desk. I wanted to see my husband, to touch his hand, to whisper the words I needed him to hear. But the young nurse at the desk offered me a polite, unsettling barrier. Mrs. Odom, I'm sorry, ma'am. We have new instructions. Only essential family members are permitted access right now, given the patient's critical state. I am his wife, I said, my voice rising slightly with indignation. I am his essential family member. The nurse shuffled the papers on her desk, avoiding my eyes. I understand, but Mr. Odom's emergency contact and power of attorney holder, your son, has placed a restriction. He feels that until Mr. Odom stabilizes, excessive visitation could interfere with the critical care routine. My breath hitched. The words hit me not as a suggestion, but as an iron door slamming shut. Power of attorney holder. It had already begun. POA. I repeated, leaning into the desk, projecting a confusion that was only half feigned. What, PO? I am Elijah's POA. We signed those documents together 10 years ago, naming me first. The nurse, now visibly uncomfortable, tapped a form. I have a signed document here, executed 3 weeks ago, stating that Marcus Odom holds temporary medical and financial power of attorney, effective immediately upon the patient's incapacitation. It's registered here as an emergency preemptive measure. We must follow the documentation on file. 3 weeks ago. This was the document Elijah was desperately trying to nullify during his final phone call. This was the confidential revision he couldn't share. They hadn't just been plotting. They had succeeded in executing the first stage of the legal takeover just weeks before the stroke, making their plot not a reaction to the crisis, but the deliberate exploitation of a pre-established legal weapon. The profound shock of this revelation that my own son had executed a legal instrument to strip me of my rights over my husband was almost unbearable. The POA meant I was not only locked out of Elijah's room, I was legally invisible in his care. I had been instantaneously downgraded from a spouse to an ordinary relative. I stood there, paralyzed by the sheer audacity of the move, feeling the isolation deepen into a cold, terrifying abyss. The nurse had already called Marcus. He arrived within 15 minutes, not rushing, but walking with the measured confidence of a man who knows he holds the winning card. He approached me with that frustratingly calm, patronizing demeanor. "Mama, what are you doing? I told you, you need to rest. You're only making things harder for the staff." "You filed a POA," I whispered, the word tasting like ash. "You filed a POA 3 weeks ago, giving yourself control over Elijah's care." Marcus sighed, running a hand over his face as if I were the unreasonable party. "It's a temporary emergency POA, Mama. It's a standard measure. Dad and I discussed it. It's to ensure a streamlined process. You're too emotional right now to make decisions about ventilation and life support. You know you are. This protects you from having to make those difficult choices." The classic manipulator's defense. "I did this to protect you." He positioned the act of stealing my authority as an act of familial mercy. It was psychological warfare disguised as bureaucratic efficiency. "We were married for 45 years, I said, my voice dangerously low. "There is no decision about Elijah that I cannot handle. But there is a decision about our finances that you cannot handle." "Mama," he countered, dropping the pretense of medical concern for a split second, revealing the naked financial core of the conflict. "Dad's estate is complicated. And given your tendency toward forgetfulness lately, the lawyers need a clear, consistent person of contact. Kira and I are providing that stability." Forgetfulness. The subtle, insidious gaslighting now used as legal justification. He was linking my supposed mental decline to his immediate need for financial access. I looked at the nurse, who quickly looked away, retreating from the uncomfortable family scene. Marcus had won the current round. He had the document, the legal authority, and the supporting narrative of my fragility. I was officially invalid. I forced myself to back down, channeling all my simmering rage into a focused, silent resolution. "I understand," I said, my voice soft, defeated. "I'll go home for a few hours. I'll come back tomorrow." Marcus's shoulders visibly relaxed. He patted my arm, a gesture of ownership rather than comfort. "That's my smart, Mama. We'll call you immediately if anything changes. Now, let me call Kira to pick you up. You shouldn't drive yourself." "No need," I replied, pulling my arm away sharply. "I am perfectly capable of driving myself home." I walked away from the desk, from the ICU, and from my husband's side. I walked not as a distraught wife fleeing the scene, but as a general retreating to her command post to gather intelligence and prepare the counterstrike. The note, the redacted POA directive, felt like a burning coal against my skin. The POA had been filed 3 weeks ago. Elijah had only collapsed yesterday. He was not just trying to warn me. He was trying to neutralize their weapon before they could fire it. His stroke had come 24 hours too soon. Now, my mission was clear. I had to prove that the POA was fraudulent, that the consent was coerced, and that the person holding the legal power was a thief. And I had to do it before the temporary POA became permanent, and before they used their new legal authority to declare me permanently incompetent. The transition from wife to legal invalid was complete. The drive home was less a journey and more an analysis. The world outside my windshield, the familiar streets, the orderly traffic seemed distant, unreal. My focus was entirely internal, dissecting every word Marcus had spoken, every gesture Kira had made. They had executed this plan with cold clinical precision. Marcus's claim that he was protecting me from difficult choices was the ultimate condescending dismissal of my role as Elijah's partner. It was the lie that justified his greed. I realized the insidious nature of the temporary POA was its simplicity. In a state of crisis, hospitals and banks default to the newest, most comprehensive legal document on file to avoid liability. They don't inquire about intent. They follow the paper. Marcus had created a legal shortcut directly to our assets and Elijah's medical fate. effectively turning my husband's sudden tragedy into his own immediate, highly profitable opportunity. When I finally pulled into the driveway of our home, a sanctuary they had already mentally priced and listed, I felt a palpable sense of intrusion, as if they were already standing in the living room. The house was too quiet, too full of the recent, terrifying silence of Elijah's collapse and the lingering echo of his desperate final warning. My first act was to check the phone messages. There were none from Marcus or Kira confirming their new strategy: isolation. If I was not at the hospital, they had no obligation to report to me. The immediate family updates would go directly to the POA holder. Marcus. My second act was to move with the speed and focus that belied their fragile diagnosis. I went straight to Elijah's small, secure home office. The door was always unlocked. Trust had been the only security we ever needed. Now I found myself approaching it as a place of necessary espionage. I located the lockbox immediately. It was hidden behind a stack of dated tax returns in the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet. Not cleverly concealed, but discreetly placed. It was a testament to Elijah's nature: methodical, careful, and deeply private when it came to financial threats. The lockbox opened with the combination: a tea I had known for 30 years, our wedding anniversary. Inside, it was a museum of our financial life: copies of our deed, our original wills, our investment bond certificates. But it was the files Elijah had placed on top that drew my full attention. There was a manila folder labeled contingency, private. I pulled it out and opened it. Inside were not just documents, but a comprehensive chronology of their betrayal, the written record Elijah hadn't had time to share before the stroke. He hadn't just feared their intentions. He had been meticulously documenting their actions for months. The documents were staggering. The original POA, 2015, signed by both of us, clearly naming me as the primary agent, and Marcus as the secondary only if I were also incapacitated. The fraudulent POA draft dated 4 weeks ago, a photocopy of the document Marcus had signed at the hospital. This was the most damning evidence. Beside Elijah's signature line was a bold, underlined, handwritten note in his hand. Consent was not granted. Coercion suspected. Do not honor. He had intended this note to be a legal flag, a written retraction of consent. But he had been unable to attach it to the filed document in time. The consultation notes: a sheaf of handwritten pages detailing every instance of Kira and Marcus's gaslighting campaign over the past year. June 14th. Kira found Lena's keys after Lena spent 20 minutes searching. Suggest senior moment. July 28th. Marcus requested Elijah sign new asset transfer form to make things easier for Lena later. Elijah refused. The depth of his vigilance was heartbreaking. He had been quietly fighting this battle alone, shouldering the terrible knowledge that his own son was a financial predator, determined to protect me from the full emotional weight of the truth. But the most critical piece of evidence lay beneath the notes: a sealed envelope. It was addressed to me, in his hand, with one word scrawled across the front: Theo. Theo Vancilage's boss. The same man the competitor's video focused on. This meant Theo was not just a side character. He was the confidant and the witness. Elijah had entrusted his boss with the final stages of his counterplan. I tore open the envelope. Inside was a simple card containing Theo Vance's private cell number and a concise instruction, written just days before the stroke: Lena, call Theo, tell him the garden is ready. He has the evidence. Move immediately. The garden is ready. A code phrase. A signal that the worst had happened, and that the preemptive defense needed to be activated. Elijah had set up an escape hatch, communication channel outside the reach of Marcus and Kira. He had not trusted his own home, or even our shared phone line, to relay the final instruction. I felt a surge of strength, a cold clinical determination replacing the shock. I was no longer fighting alone. I was executing a plan orchestrated by Elijah, whose love had proven to be his last, greatest defense. I picked up the phone. I did not call Marcus to check on Elijah's status. I was done playing their game. I called the number 4 Theodore Vance, my heart pounding a steady, martial rhythm. When he answered, his voice was crisp, professional, and slightly guarded. "Mr. Vance, this is Lena Odom. I apologize for calling you at home." "But Mrs. Odom," he interrupted gently, his voice shifting to a tone of profound, immediate recognition. "I was expecting your call, though I prayed I wouldn't receive it. You must understand that Elijah was a brilliant, highly cautious man. Before his stroke, he visited me. He anticipated this scenario, specifically the use of a fraudulent POA. "Mr. Vance," I said, reciting the code phrase with a clarity that left no room for doubt, "the garden is ready." The matriarch had found her ally. The game was now officially a contest. I was no longer the invalid retreating home. I was the matriarch activating the counterattack, using the hidden blueprint of my living ghost of a husband. I was ready to use the evidence he had secretly gathered to expose the crime and neutralize the POA. Before they could cash out on their betrayal, the conversation with Theodore Vance had been brief, precise, and utterly terrifying. His voice, cool and professional, had confirmed the core of Elijah's fears. The POA was real. The threat was immediate, and the counterplan was now activated. But the meeting was set for the following morning. I had a long, silent night ahead of me, a night I spent not grieving the man who was gone, but studying the blueprints of the man who had been fighting for both of us. The lockbox, still open on Elijah's desk, was not merely a container for documents. It was a museum of impending doom, a testament to the methodical paranoia of a man betrayed. I had looked at the files briefly before contacting Theo, but now I had the time and the desperate need to absorb every terrifying detail. I needed to understand the full weight of the evidence I was about to present to our ally. The contingency, private folder contained the chronological decomposition of my life as Elijah had observed it through the lens of Marcus and Kira's greed. It was a narrative of slow-motion theft and psychological dismantling, written in my husband's familiar, elegant script. I started with a sheaf of handwritten notes, meticulously dated over the last 11 months. It wasn't just a list of events. It was a diary of suspicion. A chilling record of conversations that I had dismissed as routine familial concern. Entry from January 12th. Kira called again today, concerned about Lena's driving. Said she almost missed the turning to the supermarket. Suggested I restrict her use of the suburban roads. Mentioned her cousin, Dr. Thorne, who specializes in senior-focused assessments. I told her the suggestion was premature. Marcus sided with her, arguing prevention is cheaper than rehabilitation. Entry from March 5th. Marcus suggested we look at downsizing. He framed it as a necessity due to Lena's increasing difficulty managing the large house. Said the current property value is too high for unmanaged care. Refused, stating explicitly that Lena's well-being is tied to her familiar surroundings. The disappointment on his face was startling. He wasn't concerned about her care. He was calculating his profit. Entry from April 29th. Kira asked me for access to the safe deposit box, just in case I had any papers related to her mother's finances. Clear attempt at probing security measures. Denied access. Later that evening, she cornered Lena, suggesting Lena had forgotten an important utility bill. Lena was visibly distressed. I paid the bill, which was not actually late, just to stop the discussion. The gaslighting is becoming aggressive. The word gaslighting it appeared repeatedly in his notes. Not as a term of drama, but as a clinical observation of a psychological tactic. Elijah had not merely been witnessing my confusion. He had been witnessing the systematic, targeted destruction of my confidence. He had seen the pattern where I had only felt shame over my own perceived failures. The missing keys. The misplaced appointment cards. The confusion over the mail, all of it had been orchestrated. Kira wasn't a clumsy assistant. She was an active operative, creating confusion to justify the necessity of Marcus's takeover. I held the notepad in my hands, a low, cold vibration starting deep in my chest. This wasn't just evidence of theft. It was evidence of cruelty. They had deliberately manufactured a mental illness in me to accelerate their access to the money. This was the medical coup Elijah had feared. They weren't waiting for natural decline. They were inducing perceived decline. I moved to the next set of documents, the legal evidence. This was the core of the attack, the power of attorney documents. First, the original The Lasting Power of Attorney LPA 2015. It was a thick, legitimate document, notarized and filed correctly, naming me as the sole primary agent. It was the bedrock of our shared security. I felt a fleeting sense of comfort looking at it. Then the second document, the frightening counterfeit. It was a partial copy of a statutory durable power of attorney stamped with a recent dates just 4 weeks ago. This document was the ultimate weapon Marcus had brandished at the hospital. And there it was, the key visual anchor of the entire conspiracy. The section reserved for grantor's signature, Elijah's signature, was not blank. It was marked. Elijah had taken a thick, black permanent marker and drawn 2 bold, aggressive diagonal lines across the signature field, obliterating the space where his name was supposed to go. Across the bottom, written in the margins, he had scrawled a furious, decisive declaration: absolutely not coercion. This document is invalid and void. The power of that single, crossed-out line was immense. It was the visual proof that the POA Marcus was using at the hospital was either a forged copy, or that Marcus had pressured Elijah to sign it and, upon Elijah's refusal, had attempted to file the voided document or a subsequent fraudulent one. It proved that Elijah's final cognitive act before the stroke was to refuse his son's scheme and leave a warning. The deeper, unique twist of our narrative lay within the detailed notes concerning the purpose of this POA. It wasn't just about accessing bank accounts, though that was certainly the immediate goal. Elijah's notes made it clear this was the prerequisite for the forced institutionalization. Entry from August 19th. Kira mentioned her friend's mother was moved to Magnolia Terrace after exhibiting disorientation episodes. She stressed the immediate need for a reliable POA to secure a spot. Marcus explicitly stated that once the POA is active and Lena is assessed by Thorne, he can handle the house sale quickly. Before any legal complications arise, handle the house sale quickly. They were not waiting for my natural death, nor even my permanent incapacitation. They were counting on the temporary POA to allow them to sell the house or home while Elijah was in the ICU. And I was declared medically compliant, enough to sign the sale papers under Marcus's supervision. The stroke had simply accelerated their timeline from months to days. I ran my hands over the cold steel of the lockbox, feeling the full, crushing weight of their contempt. They saw me, their mother, not as a person, but as a financial hurdle to be legally. They were planning to empty my life, strip away my home, and then discard me into an assisted living facility, a prisonol, while maintaining the facade of worried, responsible children. This was no longer just about money. This was about stripping away dignity, autonomy, the very foundations of my identity. The depth of the paperwork required a forensic level of scrutiny. And the long night stretched ahead. I needed to catalog every entry, every date, every suspicious comment Elijah had transcribed, transforming his fear into my ammunition. The matriarch's authority, which had been dormant, now fully awakened, fueled by the terrible certainty of the betrayal. I was ready to meet Theodore Vance. But first, I had to master the script of my own undoing. The remainder of Elijah's contingency folder detailed the financial preparations he had undertaken while secretly fighting his own son. He was auditing his own family, applying the same rigorous standards he used in his 30 years at Sterling and Grant Financial to the insidious, hidden transactions of Marcus and Kira. This section of the file was marked "The Trail of Breadcrumbs." Contained photocopies of bank statements I had never seen that had been rerouted to Elijah's work address, under the guise of an executive privacy file. This explained why I had been unable to locate certain quarterly reports, and why Kira had been so overly helpful with the mail. Elijah's notes confirmed the truth. Kira was intercepting the important correspondence, creating a blackout around our true financial status while she and Marcus slowly bled the reserves. I reviewed the photocopies with clinical horror. There were 3 key transactions that stood out, each meticulously circled and annotated by Elijah. The $4,000 withdrawal, March 8th. Annotations read, Kira claimed the refrigerator needed emergency replacement. Showed me a fraudulent estimate. Money was withdrawn from the emergency joint account. No replacement purchased. Kira bought a diamond necklace, seen receipt photo on file 2 days later. Direct theft. The credit card application, May 1st. Annotations read, found pre-approved credit card applications addressed to Lena. Marcus intercepted them. Checked credit report, 3 new cards opened in Lena's name within the last 3 months. Total available credit, $25,000. Marcus is using the cards to stabilize his gambling losses his term. Not mine. The real estate inquiry, June 20th. Annotations read, Marcus contacted a known associate realtor, K. Sims, for an appraisal of the house. Asked for a quick private sale estimate. This confirms the financial motive is immediate and tied to the forced institutionalization plan. The picture that emerged was not one of desperate children making poor choices. It was one of calculated, systematic financial engineering designed to liquidate their parents' entire estate. I sat back, the weight of the files heavy in my lap. I had always believed that the measure of a family was its ability to withstand external pressure. I never considered that the most destructive pressure would come from within, aimed directly at the foundation of trust. The grief I had felt earlier was now replaced by a cold, burning resolve. This was not a moment for tears. It was a moment for retaliation. The final piece of documentation in the file was the most heartbreaking. Connecting the clinical evidence back to the man I loved. It was a single sheet of paper, a printout of an email drafted but never sent. Addressed to me, subject. If I cannot speak, the body of the email began. My dearest Lena, if you are reading this, I have failed. I ran out of time. I tried to neutralize the POA, but I know Marcus is desperate and he will use my incapacitation to accelerate his attack on you. I have left this evidence trail not for lawyers, but for you. You must understand that your confusion was never real. It was manufactured. Your memory is sound. You are the strongest person I have ever known. Do not listen to their voices. Listen to your own. Call Theo immediately. He has the final piece of the puzzle, proof that the POA execution was fundamentally fraudulent. Do not try to fight them alone, my love. Use the law. Use Theo. You are not fragile. You are the matriarch. Reading those words, seeing the love and the absolute faith he still had in my strength despite their attempts to dismantle it, was the ultimate act of empowerment. The tears that finally came were not tears of fear or grief, but of profound, cleansing gratitude. Elijah, my living ghost, had left me not a burden, but a detailed, step-by-step counterplan. He had given me permission to stop grieving and start fighting. The matriarch's mission was no longer merely self-defense. It was the sacred duty of honoring the final, desperate struggle of the man who had loved her enough to anticipate his own tragedy. I closed the folder, the bold, crossed-out lines on the fraudulent POA document, now seeming less like a warning and more like a symbol of defiance. The dark night had passed. The first pale light of dawn was filtering through the window of Elijah's office. Theodore Vance would be waiting soon. I had the files, the proof, and the unshakable determination of a woman who had been declared invalid, but who was, in fact, more powerful and clear-sighted than she had ever been. The silence of the house no longer felt empty. It was filled with the promise of cold, calculated justice. The walk into the towering glass and steel monument that housed Sterling and Grant. Financial felt less like an errand, and more like crossing the Rubicon I was carrying. The weight of my husband's last desperate fight, and the physical proof of my son's profound betrayal. The elegant silence of Theodore Vance's executive floor. A sanctuary of polished mahogany and subdued lighting offered a stark contrast to the emotional chaos I carried within. For decades, this building had represented Elijah's quiet achievement. Now, it represented the final line of defense against the people who sought to erase me. Theodore Vance. Kia Voss, Elijah's boss of 15 years, stood when I entered his vast office. He was a man whose reserved demeanor suggested immense capability, and the gravity in his eyes confirmed his complete awareness of the crisis. There was no need for pleasantries, only the shared urgency of the mission Elijah had entrusted to us both. "Mrs. Odom," he greeted me, his voice a low, focused murmur. "Please sit." Elijah made it very clear that if you ever came to this office and used the code phrase, the danger would be immediate and the threat would originate from within the family. I settled into the deep leather chair opposite his desk, placing Elijah's contingency folder in the center of the dark wood. "The POA I stated, my voice sharp with the matriarch's authority, has already been activated by Marcus." He used Elijah's stroke as the trigger. "They are moving fast." I found Elijah's internal notes, his record of the gaslighting, his declaration that the signature was forced. Theo nodded slowly, his gaze locked on the folder. Elijah anticipated that speed. "He told me, Theo, they will wait for the first sign of weakness and they will move like sharks. That's why he initiated the reverse audit 6 weeks ago." Reverse audit. It was an internal term. Elijah wasn't just investigating Marcus's finances. He was auditing the narrative they were building around you. He knew the POA, while fraudulent, would require a compelling justification beyond simple greed to hold up in court to require a medical foundation. Theo paused, leaning forward. "Mrs. Odom, I have something that confirms that medical foundation was also bought and paid for." He reached into a secure drawer and retrieved a thick legal envelope sealed with a wax stamp. The care he took handling it suggested immense importance. He placed it next to my folder, and I could feel the tension radiating off the paper. Elijah's official position here allowed him confidential access to a specific corporate investigation resource. He used it to track unusual financial transactions tied to Marcus and Kira's personal accounts over the last 9 months. He was specifically looking for unexplained payouts, especially those linked to the medical field. My breath hitched. Elijah's notes had mentioned Kira's cousin, Dr. Silas Thorne, specializing in senior-focused assessments. Theo opened the envelope and pulled out a single, devastating document. It was a photocopy of a private banking transfer receipt, clearly showing a large sum moving out of a shell account linked directly to Kira's registered business license. "This is a transfer receipt, Mrs. Odom," Theo explained, tapping the line item that sent a cold shudder down my spine. $10,000. Transfer date 4 weeks ago. I followed his finger to the recipient line, which read S. Thorne Medical Consulting, LLC. "Silas Thorne," I whispered, the name confirming the deepest part of Elijah's fear. "Exactly," Theo confirmed. "But the annotation on the transaction is the real weapon." He pointed to a small, fine print line detailing the purpose of the transfer. It wasn't listed as a loan or a retainer. It read, "Consultation Evaluation Comprehensive Geriatric Assessment for Patient L.O." L.O. Lena Odom. The raw, undeniable proof was staring me in the face. They hadn't just relied on my natural decline. They had manufactured the evidence of it. They had bribed a Dr. Kira's cousin with $10,000 to create a fraudulent medical paper trail, proving I was mentally incapable of handling my own affairs. The early dementia narrative Kira had been pushing for months was not an opinion. It was a prepaid diagnosis. The fury I felt was clinical, purified by the certainty of the crime. This transaction receipt was more damning than the crossed-out signature on the POA. That signature proved coercion. This receipt proved criminal conspiracy. This is why the POA holds authority at the hospital, I realized aloud, the pieces clicking into place. Marcus presented this $10,000 diagnosis alongside the POA. The hospital must legally accept the medical justification for the financial control, especially in a life-threatening scenario. Precisely. The POA is the key, but the medical report is the lockpick. Theo concurred. Elijah suspected that they would move quickly to the next phase, selling the house and placing you in an institution using the medical diagnosis to silence any legal challenge. Pushed Elijah's contingency folder toward Theo, opening it to the POA section. My notes show Elijah wrote coercion across the POA signature line. Do you have any evidence of how Marcus obtained that document in the first place, if Elijah refused to sign? Theo looked grim. Elijah couldn't confirm the method, but he knew Marcus had a lawyer, an aggressively opportunistic one named Kells. Elijah's theory was simple. Marcus coerced a partial, incomplete signature, perhaps on a different draft, and Kells used it to file the temporary POA, knowing the hospital would validate it with the Thorne diagnosis. The sophistication of their betrayal was chilling. It wasn't just a grab for money. It was a calculated attempt to use the legal and medical systems as weapons to erase my existence and liquidate my life. The fact that the bribe was $10,000 a clean, round number spoke to the meticulous, heartless planning of the entire operation. My life, my dignity, and my 45 years of partnership were worth exactly $10,000 to my son. I took a long, steadying breath, feeling the matriarch's authority settle over me fully. Mr. Vance, we have the evidence of the crime, the motive, and the means. Now we need the lawyer who can break the POA and use this receipt as proof of criminal intent. Theo's eyes gleamed with a quiet satisfaction. Elijah anticipated that too. He didn't just plan the audit. He planned the defense. He established a line of communication with a lawyer who specializes in elder financial abuse, someone who is both formidable and discreet. Her name is Eleanor Vance. I blinked. Eleanor Vance. Is she related to you? She is my daughter, Mrs. Odom, and she is the best legal strategist in this city. Theo leaned back, a faint, protective smile touching his lips. Elijah trusted her completely. He knew the only person capable of defeating Marcus's legal ambush would be someone who valued truth above profit. Eleanor is waiting for us. She has already been briefed on the severity of the situation. The shift in the narrative was instantaneous. I was no longer an isolated target. I was the center of a protected counteroffensive, backed by the strategic genius of my incapacitated husband and supported by a loyal ally and his formidable daughter. The game had just changed. The next phase was war, the revelation of Eleanor Vance, Theo's daughter. The expert in elder financial abuse was the infusion of hope and cold, legal reality I desperately needed. It transformed the fight from a desperate personal vendetta into a systematic professional campaign for justice. The matriarch's wisdom dictated that sentimentality had no place in this battle. Only strategy and superior legal firepower mattered. Theo handed me a second, smaller folder. Eleanor needs this entire file, Mrs. Odom, and she needs to hear your account of the gaslighting firsthand. She specializes in dismantling the psychological narrative of incompetence that Marcus and Kira have built around you. I gathered my own resolve, carefully placing the $10,000 consultation evaluation receipt into Elijah's contingency folder. This receipt, clean and clinical, was the smoking gun. It proved that my supposed mental decline was a purchased product, not a medical reality. Theo looked at me, his gaze softening briefly. Elijah always said you were the strong one, Mrs. Odom. He said he was the shield, but you were the sword. He knew if anyone could fight this, it was you. His affirmation, rooted in 45 years of observation, was more powerful than any legal document. It neutralized the years of insidious whispers that had tried to convince me I was losing my mind. I spent the next hour with Theo, reviewing the files one last time, building the narrative for Eleanor. We meticulously cross-referenced Elijah's handwritten notes with Theo's corporate audit trail. We established the timeline of the conspiracy. The cold chronology laid bare the truth. The POA wasn't a rushed response to the stroke. It was the finalized weapon waiting for the opportunity provided by the stroke. The key, Mrs. Odom, Theo emphasized, is to move on the medical fraud first. If we can prove that $10,000 diagnosis is based on a bribe, the foundation of the POA collapses. And Marcus's legal authority over Elijah and your assets becomes a crime, not a custody issue. I nodded, the plan clear. We needed to target the root of their authority. I looked at the forged POA draft again, focusing on the crossed-out signature line. The anger returned, potent and purifying. My son had not only tried to steal my future, he had tried to erase my entire past, declaring the woman Elijah loved incompetent and easily dismissed. This fight was not just about the money. It was about the sanctity of our partnership and the legacy of our life together. As I prepared to leave Theo's executive fortress, the full weight of my new identity settled upon me. I was no longer Lena, the comfortable matriarch. I was Lena, the matriarch at war. Theo walked me to the elevator, his expression grave. Mrs. Odom, you must assume Marcus and Kira are listening. They know you have been at the hospital, and they will know you have left. They may try to isolate you further, or even physically retrieve key documents from your home. They won't find anything, I assured him, clutching Elijah's file. The house is swept clean. I am the only asset they have left to control, okay? Then we must ensure they cannot access you. Eleanor will arrange security, but until the court issues an injunction, your safety is paramount. His concern, while necessary, chafed against my pride. I did not want to be protected. I wanted to pursue the enemy. But I understood the necessity of strategy. If I were declared incompetent or disappeared, the POA would hold, and the house would be sold within days. Tell Eleanor I am ready, I said, my voice firm. Tell her I have all the evidence she needs to prove the POA is invalid. I have the notes, the coercion, and the $10,000 receipt that proves the diagnosis was a purchase. I stepped into the elevator, looking back at Theo. He offered a small, determined salute. In that moment, the entire vast financial network of Sterling and Grant felt aligned behind me. Fighting for Elijah and for the principle of justice. The elevator doors closed. Descending from the rarefied air of the executive floor to the street-level reality of my life under attack. I was heading toward a meeting with a formidable legal mind, carrying the evidence that would transform a family betrayal into a criminal prosecution. I stepped onto the bustling sidewalk. Feeling the anonymous energy of the city around me, I was no longer grieving. I was activated. The first step of the counterattack, finding the proof, was complete. The next step, legal warfare, was about to begin. Marcus and Kira had used the law as a weapon of convenience. I was about to use it as a weapon of absolute vengeance. They had mistaken my grief for weakness. They were about to discover the matriarch's wrath. The meeting with Theodore Vance had given me the weapon. But Marcus and Kira were quick to remind me that they still controlled the battlefield. Their retaliation was immediate, brutal, and entirely legal. They had anticipated that I might discover the evidence. Their countermeasure was to silence me using the very documents Elijah had tried to nullify. I returned home from Theo's office not with a sense of triumph, but with the cold, unsettling awareness of time running out. I had barely stepped across the threshold when the silence of the house was broken by a sharp, insistent knocking. Standing on my porch were two figures. A young man in a cheap suit holding a stack of papers, and a woman with an official detached expression, a process server, and a notary, Mrs. Lena Odom. The man asked, his voice flat, professional. I knew instantly what this was. This was the enemy responding to my moves, leveraging the fraudulent POA. I nodded. Holding myself stiffly, he thrust the papers into my hand. You have been served. This is an official injunction filed by the temporary power of attorney, Marcus Odom. The stack of documents was thick, dense with legal jargon designed to intimidate and confuse. I didn't need to read past the first few paragraphs to understand the devastating core of their action. The petition, filed under the strength of the fraudulent POA and supported by Dr. Thorne's $10,000 diagnosis. effectively achieved three things. First, it established a temporary restraining order, TRA, prohibiting me from accessing any joint bank accounts, investment portfolios, or safe deposit boxes held under Elijah's name or our joint names. The grounds cited were patient and spouse protection, arguing that my recent episodes of disorientation and erratic behavior, as confirmed by professional medical assessment, made me a financial liability. The moment I read the phrase erratic behavior, I realized the depth of their surveillance. They hadn't just been gaslighting me. They had been watching me, reporting my every moment of natural stress or distraction, framing it as evidence of mental collapse. My visit to Theo's office had undoubtedly been the erratic behavior that triggered this injunction. Second, the injunction requested an immediate protective custody order for Elijah, confirming that all medical decisions and visitation rights were solely vested in Marcus Odom, the POA holder, citing my inability to handle the stress of critical care. This was the final agonizing lock on the door to his room. Third, and perhaps most crushingly, the papers set a date for a formal competency hearing for me. This was their endgame. They weren't just taking my money. They were preparing to have the state declare me legally incompetent, stripping away my very identity and autonomy, making the house sale and institutionalization inevitable. The notary witnessed my signature acknowledging receipt, and the pair departed, leaving me standing in my own foyer. Holding the documents that declared me legally paralyzed, I immediately tried to test the extent of the damage. I called my primary bank, giving the familiar security phrase. The line was transferred to a stern, impersonal voice in the legal and compliance department. Mrs. Odom, we regret to inform you that pursuant to a validly filed power of attorney and an emergency court injunction served this morning, all accounts associated with Mr. Elijah Odom and all joint accounts have been temporarily frozen. Access is restricted exclusively to the named power of attorney, Mr. Marcus Odom. I am his wife. I protested, the authority I had wielded with Theo dissolving into a desperate plea. I am Lena Odom. I need access to our funds. We understand this is difficult, ma'am, the voice replied, devoid of true empathy. However, the documentation is clear. Any further attempts to access these funds will result in permanent closure of the accounts and potential legal action. The financial freeze was absolute. I was a matriarch with access to an empire of wealth, yet I was, in that moment, entirely penniless. I couldn't buy groceries, pay the utilities, or, critically, pay for the immediate legal expenses Eleanor Vance would require to file our counter motion. Marcus had effectively trapped me in my own home, cutting off my water and supplies. That the legal abuse was a physical blow, but the emotional lockout was the true source of anguish. I had to see Elijah. I had to tell him, in the unlikely event he could hear, that I was fighting, that I understood his warnings, and that I had the evidence. I drove back to the hospital, parking my car in a distant lot, adopting the demeanor of a private investigator rather than a spouse. I avoided the main entrance, knowing Marcus would have alerted security to my presence. I found the neurology ICU on the 9th floor, its windows overlooking the side courtyard. The view was slightly obscured by a neighboring structure, but I knew which room was his. I had been memorizing the hospital's layout, a necessary skill when your enemy is your own family. I walked down to the courtyard. The cold autumn air, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of my rage. I looked up, craning my neck, searching for the small, solitary window. There he was, Elijah, a still small figure in a brightly lit room, surrounded by the terrifying machinery of life support. The tubes and wires seemed to mock the vibrant life he still possessed, a life they were fighting to control. I stood there, feeling the full, crushing weight of the injustice. I could stand up to the POA. I could fight the financial freeze. But the fact that I was forced to look at the man I loved through a pane of tinted glass, reduced to an unauthorized observer by my own son, broke me. I pulled out my phone, not to call, but to record. I needed to document the emotional truth of this moment, the moment of absolute powerlessness. I pressed my hands against the stone wall, looking up at his silent window, and I whispered not to the air, but to him, to the ghost trapped inside the man I loved. Elijah? I said, my voice thick with unshed tears, projected against the cold stone. I saw the notes. I know what they did. I know about the POA, and I have the $10,000 receipt. I'm not confused. I'm not fragile. You were right. You were absolutely right. The confession was cathartic, an act of defiant communication across the invisible wall Marcus and Kira had built. I told him about Theo, about Eleanor Vance, and about the plan to use his own audit to destroy their scheme. I poured out the details of the financial freeze, the contempt of the bank, and the legal papers that declared me incompetent. I told him everything, a desperate, one-sided conversation under the silent surveillance of the hospital's upper floors. For 45 minutes, I stood there detailing the war and reaffirming my love. The emotional toll was immense. This was the low point, not the fear of losing the money, but the anguish of being legally barred from comforting the man who was suffering most. Marcus had successfully used the legal system to separate us, to impose a cruel public isolation. I finally stopped, tears streaming down my face. Not the tears of despair, but the tears of a warrior momentarily overwhelmed by the cost of the battle. I raised my hand in a farewell gesture, a silent promise. We will win this, my love. I will dismantle their game piece by piece. I promise you. The drive back from the hospital was slow, a necessary period of reassembly. The torrent of emotion I had released in the courtyard had cleansed the fear, leaving behind only the cold, sharp residue of determination. Marcus and Kira had achieved their immediate objective. They had cut off my funding and sealed my access to Elijah, making me a spectator in my own tragedy. They believed that without financial resources or emotional connection, I would crumble, proving their diagnosis of fragility correct. They underestimated the matriarch's resourcefulness. My first urgent call was to Eleanor Vance, Theo's daughter. I relayed the details of the service, the TRO, the competency hearing date, and the absolute financial freeze. Her voice, when she replied, was devoid of panic, a calm steel that sliced through the legal chaos. Mrs. Odom, this is predictable. Marcus's lawyer is using the POA and the Thorn diagnosis to create what we call a legal vacuum of vulnerability. They've neutralized you as a witness and as a defendant simultaneously. But this overreach is our advantage. My advantage is frozen, I stated, the frustration tight in my throat. I have no access to cash. I cannot even pay a retainer, let alone fund the forensic audits we need. Eleanor's response was immediate and reassuring. That's already handled. My father has moved a significant sum into my firm's trust account. It's authorized by Elijah during the reverse audit. It's legally earmarked for your defense against elder financial abuse. The funding is secure. You are not penniless. Mrs. Odom, you are simply legally quarantined. The revelation that Elijah had secured a defense fund, a secret war chest before his stroke, was the final testament to his foresight. He hadn't just predicted their greed. He had budgeted for the counter-war. The matriarch's financial paralysis was merely temporary, an inconvenience, not a defeat. Eleanor's plan was precise. We would move on to fronts. First, a counter-trial would be filed immediately, challenging the validity of the POA based on the coercion notes and the documented medical fraud. Second, she would file a motion to subpoena all banking records for Dr. Silas Thorne and Marcus's lawyer, Kells effectively turning the legal heat back onto the conspirators. But the emotional isolation is intentional, Eleanor continued, her voice hardening. They want you to feel the loss of control over Elijah. They want you to break. We need to maintain the appearance of compliance while we prepare the counterstrike. Do not engage Marcus or Kira. Do not visit the hospital again. Let them believe the freeze has worked. The instruction to stay away from Elijah was a painful echo of the TRO, but now it was a strategic necessity. I was trading immediate, emotional comfort for the ultimate victory that would restore my husband and our life. I spent the next 48 hours within the four walls of my house. The legal vacuum of my quarantine. I felt like a general confined to her tent, surrounded by maps and intelligence. I reviewed every bank statement provided by Theo. Every one of Marcus's gambling losses, every subtle theft Kira had committed. The house was cold. I couldn't adjust the thermostat without risking the bank's wrath. I ate simple, non-perishable food, living on the margins of the life I owned outright. This deliberate imposition of poverty, enacted by my own son, was the deepest form of psychological warfare. I remembered the days just before the stroke. The constant low-level anxiety Kira fostered around my competency. She would forget to pick up a prescription, then imply I had been confused about the appointment time. She would accidentally misplace mail, only to find it later, sighing about how much I had on my mind. It wasn't just gaslighting. It was strategic depletion. They were constantly taxing my mental energy, ensuring that when the actual crisis hit, I would have no reserves left to fight. The POA was the knockout punch. The gaslighting was the long, deliberate wear-down that preceded it, but the isolation failed. Instead of breaking, I focused. The coldness of the house, the empty silence of the bank accounts, they became constant. Tangible reminders of the cost of their betrayal. Every moment of discomfort fueled my resolve to ensure that Marcus and Kira would lose everything they had conspired to gain. I visualized the $10,000 receipt, the evidence of the bribe doctor, and imagined Eleanor Vance placing it squarely in front of the judge. That piece of paper was not just a receipt. It was the legal Achilles heel of their entire operation. Without the fraudulent medical diagnosis, the POA was baseless coercion, and the freeze was a legal restraint. The matriarch had reached her lowest emotional point in that hospital courtyard, whispering her love through the glass. But the consequence of that low point was not surrender. It was a hardened, unwavering commitment to justice. I was ready to use their legal weapons against them. They had declared me incompetent. I was about to prove them criminally naive. The battle for the accounts, the control over Elijah's life, then the restoration of my dignity was moving from the silence of the hospital to the high-stakes theater of the courthouse. The freeze was about to thaw, and when it did, the consequences for Marcus and Kira would be catastrophic. The matriarch's quarantine ended not in a court order, but in a discreet private meeting room downtown. Far from the prying eyes of Marcus and Kira, this was the headquarters of our counteroffensive, the war room where my grief would be sharpened into legal steel. Eleanor Vance, Theo's formidable daughter, was exactly as her father had described: sharp, strategic, and utterly focused. She was a woman who didn't waste time on platitudes. The moment I walked in, she looked directly at the thick file I carried Elijah's contingency, folder and motioned for me to begin. Theodore Vance sat quietly beside her, a silent witness and the architect of our initial defense fund. Mrs. Odom, Eleanor began, her voice crisp and efficient. The temporary restraining order and the financial freeze are designed to create panic. We will file a motion to dissolve the TRA immediately, challenging the medical basis of the POA with the evidence you provided. But first, we need to prove the motive was not just negligence, but premeditated financial devastation. I laid out the folder, spreading the evidence across the polished table: Elijah's handwritten chronology, the POA draft with the furious crossed-out signature, and the infamous $10,000 consultation evaluation receipt for Dr. Thorne. The psychological betrayal is documented here, I explained, tapping the notes on the gaslighting. But the financial motive is detailed in the annexed statements. Marcus and Kira didn't suddenly become desperate. They were planning a full liquidation of our estate for months. Eleanor took the financial files, her expression unchanging as she quickly absorbed the data. This part of the evidence was the most dehumanizing. It reduced Elijah and me 2 digits on a ledger, and Marcus and Kira 2 cold, calculating consumers of our wealth. My father's initial audit confirmed 3 major avenues of theft. Eleanor explained, pulling out copies of credit card statements that bore my name but were unknown to me. First, unauthorized credit fraud. They used your personal identification information. which Kira gained access to during her helpful organizing phase, to open 3 high-limit credit cards in your name. She circled a series of recurring transactions on one statement. They were all small at first: payments to subscription services, new clothing, insidious tiny cuts designed not to trigger a large bank alert. The amounts escalated rapidly. Eleanor continued, her pen drawing a line toward the most egregious charges. By 3 months ago, they were treating this credit line as their personal, consequence-free source of capital. Look here, one charge dated August 14th. The charge was listed as Casino Royale Reno NV. The amount was staggering. Marcus's gambling debt, I confirmed, my voice flat. Elijah noted his concerns about Marcus's increasing recklessness. This single transaction confirms his worst fears. The matriarch's wisdom dictates that gambling is not a financial risk. It is a fundamental character flaw, a willingness to destroy certainty for a momentary, chaotic thrill. Marcus's casino debt wasn't an expense. It was a visible symptom of the self-serving entitlement that drove the entire conspiracy. He saw our money not as the result of decades of labor, but as a large, static jackpot waiting to be claimed. Eleanor shifted to the second set of statements, these detailing charges made specifically by Kira. Her consumption was equally self-indulgent, but entirely devoid of the desperation that sometimes accompanies an addiction. Her theft was a lifestyle upgrade. And here is the second, highly relevant transaction, Eleanor stated, her voice hardening slightly as she encountered the sheer lack of remorse evident in the purchase. Dated September 3rd, just 2 weeks before Elijah initiated the reverse audit, and while Kira was still actively telling you how fragile you were. She placed the statement directly in front of me. I looked at the line item, and the coldness of the theft hit me with a visceral force that eclipsed even the shock of the POA. The charge read, Jewels of Fifth Avenue, $4,000. Annotation, birthday gift. I picked up the statement, staring at the clinical, terrible details. The item itself was meaningless, just another piece of adornment. But the context was everything. Kira was actively building the medical case to have me declared incompetent and locked away, all while celebrating her own birthday using my stolen credit, spending a sum that equated to half a year's premium on my husband's medical insurance. They bought a $4,000 necklace and labeled it a birthday gift on a credit card they opened using my identity, I stated. The anger, now a deep, controlled burn. They were celebrating their ability to steal while simultaneously attempting to liquidate my life. Theo, who had been silent, finally spoke, his voice low and regretful. Elijah suspected the extent of Kira's spending. But the specificity of this charge, luxury item purchased during the height of the gaslighting campaign, proves malicious intent. This wasn't merely desperation. It was a gesture of contempt. Eleanor nodded, circling the charge with a red pen. This specific evidence is crucial. It demolishes any defense that their actions were in the best interest of the family. We will use this line item in court to prove that the motive was self-enrichment, not caretaking. She then turned to the final aspect of the financial attack, the attempt to secure a second mortgage on the house. Elijah's files contained an email string between Marcus and a mortgage broker, indicating that Marcus was trying to leverage the property's equity using the newly minted POA. Even before the TRO was filed, the ultimate goal was to empty the equity, declare you and Elijah wards of the state due to your illness, and leave the state to manage the remainder of your care. Burdened by the new debt, Eleanor summarized, pushing the files together. This is not filial negligence. This is a criminal enterprise executed through legal means. The review of the financial evidence, the cascade of casino losses, and the cold reality of the $4,000 necklace stripped away the last veil of familial sentimentality. I realized that the fight was less about reclaiming assets and more about dismantling the elaborate delusion of entitlement my son and daughter-in-law had constructed. They genuinely believed that decades of my labor and Elijah's prudence somehow made them owed a portion of our wealth. justifying any means necessary to secure it. Eleanor Vance's strategy was to attack the fraud on 3 simultaneous fronts. Using the financial trail we had established, front 1, the medical fraud. We would use the $10,000 payment to Dr. Thorne to establish that the foundation of the POAs, the medical necessity of Marcus's control, was corrupt. Front 2, the financial fraud. We would use the unauthorized credit cards and the casino receipts to establish motive and malice. Front 3, the legal fraud. We would use Elijah's crossed-out signature on the POA draft to prove coercion and abuse of authority. The jewelry and the gambling debts, Eleanor stated, tapping the file, do more than just show theft. They show contempt. They purchased luxury and chaos using your identity, while simultaneously trying to label you mentally incompetent. We will use this contrast to demonstrate the profound lack of good faith required to activate the POA. I felt a wave of profound sorrow, not for the money, but for the man my son had become. Marcus had always shown a level of entitlement. But to watch him actively conspire to destroy his parents' lives for a casino, was a level of moral failure I had never conceived. He had valued the momentary thrill of the bet and Kira's superficial desires over the sanctity of his own family ties. How fast can we file the motion to dissolve the TRA? I asked, my voice taut with urgency. Every day the POA was active was another day Marcus had control over Elijah's fate in the ICU. The first step is securing the evidence, Eleanor replied. We have the documentation from Elijah's audit, but we need the external records. I've already drafted the subpoenas for the bank statements related to the $10,000 transfer and the specific credit card issuer. We file a request for an emergency hearing on the TRO within 48 hours. The speed of the legal machine was reassuring. It was methodical, predictable, and entirely lacking in the chaos that Marcus relied upon. I focused on the jewelry receipt once more. The image it conjured Kira, selecting a glittering adornment for herself while discussing my fragility with Marcus, was the perfect distillation of their callousness. It was the visual anchor of their selfishness, and it would be the key narrative point in our legal battle. It proved that while I was being emotionally and financially cornered, they were celebrating. Theo, observing my intensity, placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. Lena, you have done exactly what Elijah intended. You found the evidence and you trusted the process. You turned their secrecy into our weapon. I looked at the men who were now my most trusted allies, men who stood against Marcus out of a shared sense of loyalty to Elijah and a commitment to justice. I need to understand what happens to Dr. Thorne and the lawyer Kells, I asked, my voice cold. They facilitated a crime. They sold a diagnosis. Eleanor smiled, a sharp professional gesture that promised retribution. Dr. Thorne faces a catastrophic loss of his medical license, criminal charges for insurance fraud, and civil penalties for battery based on fraudulent medical intervention. As for Kells, the lawyer who filed the POA, we will file a complaint with the Bar Association. Using a POA he knew was coerced and supported by a bribed diagnosis constitutes a severe ethical breach. The prospect of accountability was satisfying. It proved that the legal system, once activated, could cut through the moral fog of familial obligation. Marcus and Kira had attempted to operate outside the bounds of decency. Now they would face the full, unyielding force of the law. I gathered the files, placing them back in the folder, ensuring the jewels of Fifth Avenue receipt and the $10,000 consultation receipt were both on top. This was my proof. My terrible inheritance from a betrayal that had lasted years. I stood looking at Eleanor and Theo. We are ready. File the motions. They took my money and my access to my husband. Now we take their authority, their credibility, and their futures. The matriarch left the war room feeling the strength of an army behind her. The isolation of the past few days had ended. The battle over the stolen funds and the fraudulent POA was about to move from the filing cabinet to the courtroom, where the true costs of the $4,000 necklace be exposed for all to see. The matriarch's confidence, forged in the war room over the casino receipts and the stolen necklace, was absolute. We had the evidence, the funding, and the legal strategist ready to strike. I spent the day awaiting Eleanor Vance's call, expecting news that our counter-trial had been filed, signaling the beginning of the end for Marcus and Kira's scheme. But the enemy was not waiting for our paperwork. They were anticipating it. Their greatest asset was not intelligence, but ruthlessness. And they were preparing to utilize the full, destructive potential of the fraudulent POA. Before we could dismantle its foundation, the second wave of legal papers arrived not via a polite process server, but by a bailiff, a figure of uncompromising, state-sanctioned authority. This time, the papers weren't just about financial restraint. They were about the removal of my physical freedom. I stood by the window, watching the official car pull up, feeling a cold dread settle in my stomach that surpassed the fear of the financial freeze. The papers were delivered, and the moment I saw the title emergency petition for protective guardianship and placement, I understood the terrifying escalation of their scheme. Marcus was not content with merely freezing my funds. He was attempting to have me legally locked away. The petition, filed under the POA's authority and again supported by the $10,000 diagnosis from Dr. Thorne, argued that I was not just financially incompetent, but presented a physical danger to myself. It claimed that, due to my accelerated symptoms of disorientation and paranoia, my visit to Theo's office, and my persistent questioning of their authority, I required immediate score-time care in a structured environment. The goal was transparent: secure the judicial mandate to institutionalize me before Eleanor could challenge the POA's validity. If I were legally placed in a specialized care facility, I would be rendered incapable of appearing in court, unable to communicate with my lawyer, and my claims of fraud would be dismissed as the rambling of an unstable patient. The matriarch's resolve had to steel itself against this ultimate threat. This was the moment I realized they were prepared to commit me to a prison to achieve their financial gain. Attached to the protective guardianship petition was the cruelest, most terrifying document of all: the notice of possession and immediate eviction. It stated that since the primary resident, Elijah, was indefinitely incapacitated, and the secondary resident, Lena, was deemed an unsuitable caretaker, the trust was exercising its right to take immediate possession of the property for the purpose of asset liquidation. To secure future high-level medical care, they were evicting me from the home I had lived in for 45 years. They were pushing the sale of my house while I was fighting to stay free. The papers stipulated that I had 72 hours to vacate the premises, after which law enforcement could be dispatched to remove me and transfer me to the waiting facility, Magnolia Terrace. Magnolia Terrace. I remembered Elijah's notes, the place Kira had mentioned repeatedly. It wasn't a nursing home. It was the expensive private prison they had budgeted for. It's the final destination where they would secure my silence and await the house sale. The shock was paralyzing, but only for a moment. This was not just paperwork. It was an act of aggression that demanded an immediate physical response. They had set a deadline: 72 hours. This was the terrifying race against the clock that would define the next stage of the war. I immediately called Eleanor Vance, reciting the details of the petition and the eviction notice, my voice tight with controlled fury. "Eleanor, they are moving to lock me away. They want me out of the house in 72 hours to clear it for the quick sale," I explained. Placing the eviction notice squarely on Elijah's desk, Eleanor's response was sharp and immediate, devoid of surprise. "This is a desperate, calculated move, Mrs. Odom. They know we have the POA fraud evidence. They are trying to preempt our filing by having you ruled non-compos mentees. If you are institutionalized before we file the counter-trial, your testimony regarding the POA becomes inadmissible." The gravity of the threat was not financial, but existential. My voice, my truth, and my very freedom were the targets. "We have to stop the eviction," I insisted. "If they gain control of the property, they can execute the sale immediately." Eleanor confirmed the strategy. "We pivot. We hold the full POA fraud filing, and instead, we file a highly targeted emergency motion to quash the eviction and the protective guardianship petition. We will argue that the petition is vexatious and based on fraudulent medical reports, a direct abuse of the POA authority. The clock was ticking. The next day was our deadline. The battle was no longer over the right to see Elijah. It was over the right to occupy my own life. I had to face the terrifying reality that my son was prepared to use the power of the state to forcibly remove me from my sanctuary and silence me forever. The matriarch had been backed into the tightest, most dangerous corner of the entire conspiracy. The remainder of the day became a blur of frantic legal coordination. Eleanor Vance dispatched a private runner to collect my signature on the emergency documents, while I prepared the house for a potential confrontation. The matriarch's training, the years of managing chaos and ensuring stability kicked in. I was not fleeing. I was preparing a stand. The threat of the eviction notice was not merely to my housing, but to my legal standing. If I was forcibly institutionalized, the court would view the physical seizure of the property by the trust as a standard procedural step. The home that had been my safe harbor for decades was now the final piece of the puzzle Marcus needed to complete his liquidation plan. I walked through the rooms, the silence now heavy with the possibility of loss. I looked at the dining room where Elijah had given his final coded warning. I looked at the filing cabinet that held the crossed-out signature, the evidence of their coercion. The irony was almost unbearable. Everything I owned was secure, yet my right to occupy it was being legally revoked by the very person I had raised. I called Eleanor one last time that evening, seeking clarity on the terrifying legal process of protective guardianship. Eleanor, what happens if the judge sides with the petition before you file the countermotion? Mrs. Odom, if the protective guardianship is granted, a court-appointed guardian ad litem would be assigned to you. You would be taken immediately to Magnolia Terrace, and your testimony is essentially neutralized. They win? We cannot let that happen. Her words painted a terrifyingly clear picture of my near future. Institutionalization based on a bribed medical opinion, managed by a son who saw me as an obstacle to be bypassed. Then we must ensure the court sees the malicious intent behind this eviction notice, I stated. They are trying to liquidate the house to cover Marcus's gambling losses and Kira's jewelry purchases, not to secure Elijah's care. We have the proof. The $4,000 necklace was bought while they were planning to put me in a home. Eleanor seized on the point. That is the narrative we will stress in the emergency motion. We will argue that the emergency petition is not medical, but purely vendetta and liquidation. The plan was set. Eleanor would file the countermotion first thing in the morning, requesting an immediate hearing to quash the eviction and the protective guardianship. The urgency of the eviction notice, the 72-hour clock, forced the judge's hand. The legal system, slow and methodical, was now forced into a sudden burst of speed, creating the perfect window for our ambush. I hung up the phone and walked to the kitchen, preparing for the long, cold night ahead. I was alone, surrounded by the legal papers that declared me both mentally unfit and physically unwanted. But I was not without my own resources. I carried Elijah's file with me everywhere. I read the draft email he had written to me once more. You are the strongest person I have ever known. Do not listen to their voices. Listen to your own. The matriarch had listened. She had gathered the evidence, secured the defense, and was now standing firm against the ultimate threat. Marcus and Kira had played their final, most aggressive hand, the attempt to lock me up and sell my home. Tomorrow, the battle would move to the courthouse, and the cost of their conspiracy would finally be put on full display. They believed they were fighting a fragile, incompetent woman. They were about to discover the full, unwavering wrath of the matriarch fighting for her freedom, her marriage, and her entire life. This was not the polite battlefield of the hospital waiting room. This was a court of law, a stage where the truth, armed with evidence, could finally confront the lie. I walked into the courthouse flanked by my unwavering allies, Theodore Vance, whose loyalty transcended the professional, and Eleanor Vance, whose sharp confidence was the armor I desperately needed. The courtroom was small, reserved for emergency motions. I saw Marcus and Kira seated at the opposing table, their lawyer, Kells, a man whose tailored suit seemed to conceal a profound lack of ethics, hovering beside them. Marcus looked pale, but still maintained an arrogant composure. Convinced that the POA, stamped and filed, was an unassailable shield, Kira beside him was carefully dressed in somber colors, projecting the image of a distraught daughter-in-law fighting for her elderly family's well-being. Their performance was flawless. But I carried the script that proved it a total fabrication. The moment the judge entered, the air thickened. Eleanor was granted the floor first, presenting our emergency motion to quash the eviction and the protective guardianship petition. "Your Honor," Eleanor began, her voice clear and cutting, "we are not here merely to quash a vexatious eviction. We are here to expose a premeditated criminal conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse and forcible institutionalization, all executed under the guise of a fraudulent power of attorney." She didn't waste time on sentiment. She went straight to the heart of the matter. The invalidity of the POA. The petitioner, Marcus Odom, relied on three foundational pillars to gain control over his parents' lives: his father's incapacitation, his mother's alleged mental decline, and a valid POA. We intend to dismantle the latter too. Eleanor walked to the stand and presented the POA document that Marcus had filed, the one with Elijah's name signed as the grantor. She then held up the copy of Elijah's internal audit file, specifically focusing on the document I had carried home from the office. "Honor, we present Exhibit A, the draft power of attorney recovered from Elijah Odom's private files penned days before his stroke. Note the signature line." She placed the exhibit on a large presentation screen visible to the judge in the opposing table. The image filled the screen, the thick, aggressive black marker lines slashing across the signature space, and Elijah's furious handwriting declaring the document absolutely not coercion. This exhibit proves beyond doubt that the grantor, Elijah Odom, not only refused to sign the POA, but explicitly marked the document as void due to duress and coercion. The document Mr. Odom filed is, therefore, either a forgery or was obtained under circumstances that negate consent, rendering the POA null and void due to fraud. Marcus's composure cracked instantly. He leaned toward his lawyer, Kells, whispering furiously. Kells, however, stood up, feigning indignation. "Objection, Your Honor. This is inadmissible hearsay. These are self-serving, unverified scribblings from a man who is currently incapacitated and whose mental state, as confirmed by medical professionals, is questionable." "Ah, the medical professionals," Eleanor replied, turning back to the judge with a dangerous calm. "Your Honor, this brings us to the second pillar of their fraud, the diagnosis of Mrs. Lena Odom's incompetence. We now present Exhibit B, the purchase receipt for the supposed medical justification." Eleanor projected the photocopy of the banking transfer, the cold clinical proof of the bribe. The text filled the screen. Recipient S. Thorne Medical Consulting, LLC, amount $10,000. Purpose: consultation, evaluation, comprehensive. Geriatric assessment for patient LO. This receipt, obtained via subpoena, proves that the medical assessment that ruled Mrs. Odom incompetent, the very assessment used to justify the POA, the financial freeze, and the current protective guardianship petition, was bought, paid for with a $10,000 transfer from an account directly controlled by Marcus Odom and Kira Odom to Dr. Silas Thorne, Kira Odom's relative. It's not a medical diagnosis. "Your Honor," Eleanor concluded, her voice ringing with authority, "this is a purchased precondition for financial crime. The POA is not only coercive, it is based on criminal medical fraud. Therefore, the POA is invalid." Kells looked utterly deflated. But Marcus, in a desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative, stood up abruptly, speaking over his lawyer's panicked attempts to silence him. "This is a desperate trick, Your Honor. My father was confused. My mother is a paranoid woman obsessed with family drama. They are old. They were going to die soon anyway. The statement, "they were going to die soon anyway," was the complete, unvarnished truth of his motive, justification for theft rooted in the expectation of his parents' mortality. He hadn't just admitted to theft. He had admitted to counting the days. The judge slammed his gavel down, the sound cracking like a whip. "Order, Mr. Odom. Your behavior is unacceptable. You will sit down immediately." But the damage was done. The lie of the caring son was irrevocably shattered by his moment of raw narcissistic frustration. Eleanor seized the opportunity, her voice calm amidst the chaos. "Your Honor, the petitioner's unguarded statement reveals the precise malice and predatory entitlement that fueled the POA. He saw his parents' remaining years not as a gift, but as an obstacle to be bypassed for immediate financial gain." She then moved to the financial proof, showcasing the depth of the fraud that accompanied the POA. She presented the evidence of the unauthorized credit cards and the casino receipts. We now present Exhibit C, documentation proving that while the petitioner was filing for protective guardianship of his fragile mother, he and his wife were actively looting her credit lines. This includes high-limit casino debts incurred by Marcus Odom and the purchase of a $4,000 necklace by Kira Odom, luxury item purchased in the midst of a fabricated health crisis. The motive is clear, Your Honor. Liquidation for personal enrichment, not caregiving. The judge listened intently, his pen flying across his notes. He looked directly at me, the woman they had tried to label as paranoid and incompetent. I met his gaze, my posture rigid, my eyes holding the unshakable truth of the matriarch. I didn't need to speak. The evidence spoke with 1,000 times more force than any verbal defense. Kells, desperate, tried one last defense, arguing that the POA was standard and that Elijah's notes were unreliable. "Your Honor, Mrs. Odom has been isolated and manipulated by her husband's former business associates. This is a case of undue influence by Mr. Vance." Theodore Vance, sitting behind Eleanor, simply handed her a final sealed envelope. Eleanor opened it, smiling coldly at Kells. "Your Honor, in response to the allegation of undue influence, we submit Exhibit D, a copy of a police report filed last week regarding an incident at the hospital on the night of Elijah Odom's stroke. Surveillance footage shows Marcus Odom accessing his father's medical records and making unauthorized copies. This was not a distressed son. This was a thief securing his documentation." The judge laid down his pen and addressed Marcus directly, his voice heavy with finality. "Mr. Odom, the evidence presented the coerced POA, the documented financial fraud, the clear criminal medical bribery, and your own testimony regarding your parents' mortality leads this court to a single conclusion. Your actions constitute a profound abuse of trust and a malicious conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse." He raised his gavel, delivering the judgment that dismantled their entire operation. The power of attorney filed by Marcus Odom is hereby invalidated and revoked. The temporary restraining order on Mrs. Odom's accounts is immediately dissolved. The petition for protective guardianship is quashed, and the eviction notice is ruled moot. He looked at me, a flicker of genuine respect in his eyes. "Mrs. Odom, full control over your life, your assets, and your husband's care is restored to you, effective immediately. Furthermore, given the severity of the financial fraud, this court will recommend these findings, along with all exhibits, be immediately forwarded to the District Attorney's Office for criminal investigation into Marcus Odom, Kira Odom, and Dr. Silas Thorne." Marcus stared straight ahead, his face utterly white, realizing the crushing cost of his entitlement. Kira, beside him, buried her face in her hands, her feigned sympathy now replaced by genuine, desperate terror. I did not celebrate. I simply gathered my files, the POA document now meaningless, and looked at Theodore Vance, giving him a small, controlled nod of acknowledgement. The matriarch had reclaimed her life. The courthouse showdown was over, and the POA was invalid. The victory was total. Leaving the courtroom, the silence that followed the judge's final gavel was not quiet. It was deafening, filled with the echoes of Marcus's destructive entitlement and the cold reality of the criminal investigation that now hung over him and Kira. The moment the ruling was delivered, Marcus and Kira became criminals in the eyes of the law, not merely estranged family members. Their lawyer, Kells, hustled them out of the courtroom, their expressions a mixture of blind panic and disbelief. They had expected a quiet win based on fraudulent paperwork. They had instead been exposed to the full, uncompromising force of justice. Eleanor Vance and Theodore escorted me to a private consultation room. The tension broke, replaced by the profound relief of successful strategic execution. Theodore embraced me, his voice thick with emotion. "Elijah would be proud, Lena. You fought them exactly as he planned. You gave them no quarter. But it was Eleanor who gave me the true measure of the victory. She spread out a timeline, not of the past, but of the immediate future, the consequences for the conspirators. The judge's criminal referral is the crucial pivot," Eleanor explained, pointing to the documents. "The district attorney's office is prioritizing this due to the severity of the charges: elder financial abuse, criminal fraud, and conspiracy to commit unlawful confinement." The sheer weight of those criminal titles settled over me. This was no longer a squabble over inheritance. It was a matter for the penal code. "The immediate consequence for them," Eleanor continued, "is financial chaos. We filed a successful motion to freeze the assets of both Marcus and Kira, including all of their personal bank accounts and any investments made in the last year, pending the criminal investigation. This is to ensure that the money they stole, including the funds used to pay Dr. Thorne and the cost of the $4,000 necklace, is not moved or liquidated." Financial retribution was swift and complete. Marcus, who had thrived on the chaos of gambling debt, was now facing absolute financial lockdown. Kira, who had celebrated her perceived victory with luxury purchases, now had those assets frozen, potentially seized as evidence of criminal motive. I felt a surge of detached satisfaction. They had used the freeze to paralyze me. Now, the state was using a justified freeze to paralyze them. The price of their entitlement was immediate and severe. "What about Dr. Thorne?" I asked, my voice calm. "Dr. Thorne is facing the complete revocation of his medical license and multiple felony charges. He sold his professional integrity for $10,000. He will now pay with his career and his freedom. He is already under investigation." Accountability was absolute. Every piece of their fraudulent scheme was collapsing, dragging the conspirators down with it. But the victory felt hollow in one crucial aspect. I looked at Theodore, then back at Eleanor. "And Marcus? What is the final consequence for the relationship?" Eleanor sat back, her professional demeanor softening slightly. "Mrs. Odom, the court has stripped him of all legal standing. He is barred by restraining order from any communication or approach toward you or Elijah. Legally, the relationship is severed. Emotionally, only you can make the final determination. But you must understand, justice is not a win. It is the restoration of your peace." The goal was not to see Marcus punished, but to ensure his destructive influence was permanently removed from my life and Elijah's. He chose greed over family. I stated the finality of the decision setting like stone in my heart. He chose entitlement over his father's last wishes. There is nothing left to reclaim. The relationship is severed. The official end of the line came not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet final nod to my lawyer. The matriarch had mourned the loss of her son the day he filed the POA. Now, she was simply confirming the burial of the relationship. The price of his entitlement was the total loss of his family connection and his freedom. The first call I received was from the bank's legal and compliance department. Their tone shifted from stern command to deferential apology. My accounts were immediately unfrozen. The matriarch's financial autonomy was restored, complete with backdated interest. The power of the law once wielded against me was now my instrument of reclamation. My next stop was the hospital. This time I walked into the neurology. I see you not as a rejected visitor, but as the legally authorized spouse, the one with full medical control. The nurses and staff who had been informed of the POA invalidation were immediately apologetic and respectful. I walked into Elijah's room, devoid of the fear that had plagued me days before. The machines were still humming, but now they represented his life, not their control. I sat beside him, taking his hand in my hand, and felt the familiar, grounding warmth of his skin. "We won, my love," I whispered, resting my head against his shoulder, finally allowing the full weight of the emotional ordeal to ease. "The POA is gone. Marcus is gone. Our life is safe." I stayed with him for hours, simply being present, knowing that the most immediate act of justice was securing his peace and his dignity. The money was secondary. His care, his security, and his right to be undisturbed by their predatory greed were paramount. Later that evening, Eleanor and Theodore joined me at my home. I had been just 72 hours from losing to an illegal eviction. We sat around the dining room table, now freed from the weight of secrecy, planning the future instead of fighting the past. "Mrs. Odom, the criminal investigation will proceed quickly," Eleanor reported. "Marcus and Kira will be facing arraignment soon. The evidence, especially Elijah's notes and the $10,000 diagnosis receipt, is overwhelming." I looked at the documents one last time, the POA draft with the furious X marks. "I want the debt paid," I stated, my voice calm but absolute. "I want the fraudulent credit card debt paid off and the money they stole from the savings restored. I want every trace of their criminality scrubbed from our financial record. But I do not want the house back." Eleanor looked surprised. "You don't want the house back, but you fought so hard to save it from the eviction." "I fought to save it from their control." I corrected, a faint smile touching my lips. Elijah was right. The house is too big for two people, and it is now too full of complicated memories. The betrayal, the gaslighting, the threat of the sale. It is tainted. I looked at Theodore, whose expression was one of quiet understanding. "We will sell it, Theo. Not quickly, not under duress, but carefully. We will use the money to build a new life, a new sanctuary for Elijah and me, far away from the shadows of this betrayal." The decision was final and deeply liberating. I was reclaiming my right to choose, not just to react. The ultimate justice was not the punishment they faced, but the freedom I earned. Before they left, Eleanor repeated the crucial truth of the entire ordeal. Justice is not a win. It is the restoration of your peace. That restoration was now complete. It was a matriarch who had been tested by the deepest form of betrayal. Betrayal of her own child, and I had emerged not broken, but profoundly strengthened. The price of their entitlement had bought me a priceless lesson. The courage to sever toxic ties and prioritize my own well-being. The fight for the POA had cost me a son, but it had saved my life and my marriage. The future was unwritten, but it was mine, and mine alone to command. The large house, once a fortress of security, had become a mausoleum of betrayal, its walls echoing with the whispers of gaslighting and the terrifying threat of the eviction notice. As the legal dust settled, Marcus and Kira facing arraignment, Dr. Thorne losing his license, I put the property on the market, choosing to liquidate the tainted asset on my terms. I was reclaiming not just the money, but the power of choice. The sale was swift, clean, and financially satisfying. The money, now secure and untouched by Marcus's entitlement, represented pure freedom. We used a portion of it to purchase a small, sun-drenched cottage in a town 3 hours away, nestled in the mountains, Redwood Springs. A place where the air was clean, the community was anonymous, and the soil was perfect for Elijah's planned garden. The move was the hardest step, a physical uprooting of 45 years of history. But it was a necessary separation from the shadow of their greed. We moved not in a state of defeat, but in a profound act of liberation. Meanwhile, Elijah's slow, arduous recovery provided the emotional foundation for our new life. The stroke had silenced him, but it had not broken his spirit. He remained in a stable, nonverbal state, requiring constant care. Yet his eyes, those wise, knowing eyes that had warned me of the danger, followed me with an alertness that confirmed his comprehension. The POA was gone, and my right to manage his life, based on love and partnership, was restored. I spent the final days in the old house with Elijah, sitting by his bedside, reading to him from the books we loved. I told him about Redwood Springs, describing the mountain views and the quality of the soil for his roses. I spoke as if he were listening intently, because I knew in the core of my being that he was. Our conversation had simply shifted from verbal exchanges to the language of sustained, unwavering connection. The morning we finally left, I took one last look at the large, empty house. There was no sadness, only the deep, clean satisfaction of survival. I had navigated the abyss of betrayal and emerged with my marriage intact, my sanity restored, and my autonomy fiercely protected. Our new life began not with grand gestures, but with the quiet miracle of Elijah's first physical therapy session in the new town. The specialists were kind, unaware of the legal war we had just survived, treating him simply as a patient on the path to recovery. I was simply Lena, his devoted wife, relieved of the burden of fighting to prove my competency every single day. One afternoon, 6 months after the move, I watched Elijah from the window. The specialists had been working on his upper body strength, and I saw him sitting on the porch of the cottage, struggling to hold a heavy ceramic gardening trowel. It was a tiny, monumental victory. He was preparing the soil for his garden, slowly, deliberately, reclaiming his physical life, just as I had reclaimed our legal life. The matriarch's reflection on this chapter was one of profound wisdom gained at a terrible cost. The gaslighting, the subtle, persistent attempts by Kira and Marcus to make me doubt my memory, my decisions, and my perception of reality had been the most terrifying weapon they wielded. The POA was the legal cage, but the gaslighting was the psychological key that was meant to unlock my own surrender. I realized then that the greatest victory was not the quashing of the legal document, but the restoration of my sanity. I looked back at the moments I had been convinced of my own decline, the misplaced keys, the forgotten appointments, and recognized them as carefully manufactured lies. We made new friends, people who knew nothing of the POA, the $10,000 diagnosis, or the son who had tried to erase us. Our circle was built on mutual respect and shared joy, free from the insidious calculations of entitlement. This was the true meaning of the peace Eleanor Vance had promised. The news of Marcus and Kira eventually reached me, filtered through a brief formal update from Eleanor. The criminal charges were moving forward. Dr. Thorne had lost his license and was facing jail time. Marcus and Kira had drained their own remaining funds defending themselves against the fraud charges, culminating in a final public reckoning that mirrored the chaos they had tried to impose on us. They had lost everything: their credibility, their careers, and the last desperate hope of accessing the wealth they believed they were owed. I felt no satisfaction in their downfall, only the profound sadness of a parent witnessing a self-inflicted wound. Marcus had chosen his fate the moment he signed the fraudulent POA. He had counted the days until our death. Now, his own future was measured in probation and restitution. The matriarch's justice was complete, but the mother's heart carried the unavoidable ache of the permanent loss. I often thought about Elijah's final, frantic code. "The garden is ready." He hadn't just been warning me about the POA. He had been giving me the blueprint for our escape and the instruction for our new beginning. The garden was ready to be planted, fertilized by the painful lessons of the past. One sunny afternoon, I joined Elijah on the porch. He sat holding the trowel, looking out at the freshly turned soil where the first of his rose bushes would be planted. I settled beside him, taking his hand. His grip, though weak, was sure. "We are here, my love," I murmured, leaning my head against his. "We are safe. We chose our own ending. The decision to sell the house, to sever the ties, to move 3 hours away, was all an affirmation of the matriarch's ultimate power. The power to define her own terms of happiness. I realized that my strength had been dormant for years. Hidden beneath the comfort of Elijah's protection and the familiarity of family routine, the betrayal had not broken me. It had forced me to awaken the sword Elijah knew I always carried. The greatest freedom was knowing I had fought the battle not for the money but for my sanity. I had refused to believe the lies they sold about my incompetence. I had chosen autonomy over blind loyalty. I had chosen myself. I looked out over the sun-drenched hills of Redwood Springs, the image of the furious. Crossed-out signature on the POA now faint, replaced by the reality of the thriving life we were creating. The journey had been harrowing, a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest dangers lie not outside your gates, but within your own bloodline. The matriarch's voice, now restored to its full authority, spoke the final, definitive truth of the storied truth that transcended the financial fraud and the legal battle, resting solely on the ultimate act of self-reclamation. I lost a son, but I saved my marriage, my home, and the woman I was meant to be.